Grace, mercy, and peace to you, Internet. Welcome back to Lutheran in a Strange Land. This is part 2 in our series on the zombie heresy of theological liberalism. There's a link to part 1 in the description below. Please check that out first if you haven't already, because this time we are going to move on from the introduction and talk about the history of this heresy. And that really begins in the Enlightenment. That is the cultural and philosophical movement that dominated the European intellectual elites beginning in the 18th century, and started flowing out to trickling down to the common folk in the 19th and 20th centuries. There's this growing sense at the time that religion in general, and Christianity in particular, was incapable of being a spiritual and intellectual foundation for humanity. And in a way, it's kind of hard to blame them for having this attitude. While Europe had traditionally looked to the church and to the scriptures to be an anchor for civilization, Christians had unfortunately spent the last 100 years or so after the Reformation killing one another and being in sometimes violent disagreement over what God actually said to them. So the elites began looking for alternatives that would end these conflicts and unite people, and end all these ongoing warfares and whatnot. Again, a narrative that you still have in place today. So they found their answer, their alternative to religion, in the intellect, particularly in logic and in science. And the idea was basically that even a Protestant and a Catholic, they could follow the same intellectual process or perform the same experiment in the same laboratory and reach the same conclusions. So, yeah, science could be a great way of unifying people. And it was making very big discoveries, Earth revolving around the sun and so forth, things like that, which really shook up the way that people conceived of the world. Again, I know I'm really glossing over the story there, but it's fine for now. So as a result of that, you had this very, very high view of science and a very, very low view of religion. And everybody's kind of, the elites at least, were really looking to science as being the savior of humanity. And the consequence of all this was that Enlightenment philosophers were they were encouraging this kind of mechanization of the human mind. The brain became nothing more than an intellectual machine that it is, you feed in the right data and it will churn out objective results. And that's all there was to it. And people really began worshiping their reason in place of God. And sometimes this is quite literal. For example, during the French Revolution, the cult of reason, they set up a statue of the goddess of reason in Notre Dame and would worship it. But even when it's not literally the case, figuratively speaking, reason very, very much took the place of God in the mindset of the intellectuals of the time. And there was this very deep skepticism about pretty much anything that was outside the personal experience of European intellectual elites. One extreme example of this, the famous skeptical philosopher David Hume, he claimed that it would be utterly irrational for a person to believe in snow until they had personally experienced it. Yeah, it doesn't matter how many other people had seen it or written about it or anything. If it's outside your experience, you should be skeptical of it. And so again, given their experience, specifically the experience of European intellectuals who were worshiping their reason, you have this deep skepticism about any subject on which people couldn't follow an intellectual process and reach the same conclusion. And anything that you couldn't boil down and put in a test tube or carry out in a laboratory. And this really began a slow but massive decline in the arts and the humanities. This is kind of how we went from the Sistine Chapel to splotches of paint on canvas that even professional art critics can't always tell the difference between the work of professionals and the work of children or guerrillas even. just splattering stuff on canvases mindlessly. Because art is a lot more than mechanical. There should be a lot more to it. Likewise, nature. They saw nature as explainable entirely in terms of the laws of nature that humans can understand, without any kind of recourse to any kind of supernature, anything beyond what humans can understand. So, no miracles, no God. Nothing of that kind was really allowed in their thought. And so, naturally, this would end up rejecting spirituality and religion. But in the 19th century, you had a lot of people in response to this ejection of religion and spirituality. You had about this bunch of people who were trying really hard to bring spirituality back in through the back door. Not in the way that would end up questioning the culture's worship of reason, but enough to carve out some kind of niche for religion and some kind of niche for spirituality. And there are two kind of key figures that we're going to talk about in this transformation here. The first is a philosopher, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. If you couldn't guess from the name, he's German. He lived from 1770 to 1831. And hugely influential German philosopher. You really can't overstate how influential Hegel ended up being. He was raised Lutheran, to our shame, but he ended up rejecting the faith in his college years and ultimately became an atheist. At least that's how most people read him. He kept his atheism hidden for the sake of his career by using a lot of Christian language for non-Christian concepts. And again, I say for the sake of his career, again, this was in vogue, but it was only in vogue among the intellectual elites who were receiving funding and patronizing and so forth from folks who weren't necessarily on board with all of this yet. So you still had to put on a facade. It was still a social requirement for just to be a good, decent, German to have some kind of facade of spirituality, some facade of Christianity on yourself. So Hegel did that, and he used a lot of Christian terminology for non-Christian concepts. But again, most scholars today will think that he was either an atheist or possibly a pantheist, depending on how you look at it, but certainly not Christian in any meaningful sense of the term. So, what was his philosophy? One of the biggest points that you'll hear repeated from his work is the Hegelian dialectic. So you have this idea of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. You have these two opposing ideas that will eventually merge and become something else entirely. At least that's the oversimplification of it. Hegel never actually used the term thesis, antithesis, or synthesis. That's just kind of how his ideas got popularized. But to oversimplify this, because we're not going too in depth here, Hegel thought that in history you constantly have two opposing modes of thought fighting against one another, battling it out. But what you don't have is one side eventually winning over the other and dominating it. You don't have a winner and loser. What you end up having is that both those two opposing forces end up combining into a third thing altogether with different characteristics from the first two things. And this dialectic really revolved around what Hegel called the Zeitgeist, the spirit of the age. And again, that at least is probably a term that you've heard, Zeitgeist. And so the idea there is that, and just bear with me, I know this is not exactly accessible here, but bear with me. Pause and go back if you need to. So the Zeitgeist. There is, according to Hegel, this unconscious spirit, which again, sometimes he refers to that spirit as God. And this unconscious spirit permeates all of the universe. And this is where you get the thesis, one of his theses. And this idea of potential freedom. This spirit has potential freedom. It can become anything. It can become everything. But that freedom is only potential, because the spirit does not yet have a mind by which it could, consciously decide to become something. But this spirit is becoming conscious. It's becoming conscious through mankind's consciousness, through human consciousness. And the spirit acts out through mankind's activity. And this is where the antithesis comes in. You have potential freedom, the thesis, and the antithesis is actual bondage, against actual being the opposite of potential, bondage being the opposite of freedom. Actual bondage. And according to Hegel, as the spirit, as it becomes real, it becomes real as it wakes up, as it becomes conscious, as through humanity, and as it begins thinking. But the humans through which it becomes conscious, they create religions and thought structures that imprison and bind the spirit of the age. They bind humanity. They control them to control the way they think, control the way they behave, control which ideas are permissible, and so forth. And so while the spirit is becoming conscious, it's not yet self-conscious. In other words, the spirit of the age doesn't recognize itself as God. Again, according to Hegel, the spirit of the age is God, but it's not self-conscious of itself as God. It doesn't realize that it's God yet. And so in history, you saw those two concepts fighting against each other, this potential freedom versus this actual bondage. And so you have some men who are yearning to be free, while other men oppress them and imprison them in cultural and religious norms and so forth. But the spirit, the zeitgeist, is slowly becoming self-conscious through this dialectic. And so you end up with a synthesis, actual freedom. You have the actual from actual bondage, you have the freedom from potential freedom, actual freedom. Which, to be perfectly blunt about it, is essentially mankind recognizing itself as God. Again, that's the zeitgeist. The zeitgeist is God. It becomes conscious through human consciousness. It has to become self-conscious, has to recognize itself as God. So that is human consciousness recognizing itself as God. And every step that mankind makes through the dialectic brings itself closer to this synthesis. And to this ultimate end. And it's very interesting. The Bible refers to Satan as the spirit of the age, and Hegel's philosophy is certainly demonic, because it is literally "ye shall be as gods." It is the original temptation from the garden. But it caught on in a huge way, and from Hegel you get this idea of progress, that mankind is slowly but inevitably becoming better, becoming greater, becoming higher, wiser, more advanced, more powerful, and more godlike in everything that we do. And according to Hegel, the zeitgeist is at work wherever the world is looking, wherever the eyes of the world rest, and wherever mankind is the most advanced. So naturally, if you're a 19th century European philosopher, you're going to see the world as looking at 19th century Europe in general. And naturally, if you're a 19th century German Enlightenment philosopher, you're going to see the world as looking at Germany as being the pinnacle of human civilization, and where the zeitgeist is the most at work. And yeah, for Hegel, Germany was the pinnacle of human civilization. It was a model for the rest of the world to follow, and it was simply the focal point that everybody should be striving towards. And of course, you go a century forward and you know exactly where that led. But exactly where mankind looks, that changes over time. Hegel naturally saw it looking at Germany. I had a religiously Hegelian philosophy professor when I was taking some college courses while I was at seminary, and he actually considered himself, in a sense, a reincarnation of Hegel. He thought that the zeitgeist was currently alighting upon the twin stars of Barack Obama and Jeremiah Wright. This is in 2010. And they were the two who were leading humanity on towards this recognition of its own godhood. So, yeah, goes in some very crazy places there. But, today we have, the benefit of almost 2 centuries worth of hindsight on this thing. And when we have plenty of evidence to the contrary when it comes to the idea of human progress. If you actually look at history, if you actually look at who we are and what we've done, it is always one step forward, one step back for humanity. Yeah, we abolish feudalism and we abolish serfdom, which is great, but then we embrace communism and fascism, which was not so great. We increase our understanding of the universe, and we build these enormous cities, and these wonderful inventions, and we cure all kinds of different diseases, and then we use those exact same understanding of the world to kill each other on absolutely unprecedented scales. We free the slaves. We start murdering the unborn by the tens of millions. History very clearly shows that the Hegelian sort of progress is a myth. It is the short-sighted dream of very, very arrogant men. But nevertheless, this myth lives on. And it grew, it lived on, and the vast majority of people in the West, we believe in progress. Even if we don't necessarily believe in Hegel's spiritual explanation of progress, so many of us, we still cling to that shiny Star Trek style scientific utopia that, man, it's going to be ushered in just any day now. Any day now we're going to get over the old stuff and usher in this new age where we recognize how great we truly are. Very prominent spot in the Western consciousness. Very unfortunate that it holds such a prominent spot. That's going to change, but it is what it is, and it came from Hegel. Hugely influential. You can't overstate that. So Hegel is one of these pillars, if you will, of theological liberalism, bringing this idea of progress in that sense. The other key figure is a theologian this time by the name of Freidrich Schleiermacher, who, again, as you might have guessed from the name, is German. He lived from 1768 to 1834. And Schleiermacher was the son of a preacher man. His father was a chaplain in the Prussian army. And so he followed in his father's footsteps. He joined the family trade, and he went off to school to become a preacher and a theologian himself. And as he grew up and as he acquired more of the rationalistic education of the day, he became beset by these severe doubts about his faith. Because again, skepticism of all things religious or metaphysical had become all the rage in the academies around this time. And many, many young people were beset by these doubts. And according to Schleiermacher, and I think it's probably true, those teachers who were actually orthodox dismissed his doubts as unimportant. They didn't address them. Their solution, if you want to call it that, was if you have these doubts, just stop having the doubts. Have faith and stop doubting, which terrible thing to tell somebody. But again, I believe it because I see people doing the same thing today. I have a link about doubts in the description below. I'll put that in there. But so according to Schleiermacher, yeah, he had these doubts. The people who should have been training his mind were dismissing those doubts instead of dealing with them in reasonable ways. And that included his own father, who merely indicated that, he'd read some of the works of these skeptics, and they're not important. So don't worry about it. Don't make a big deal about it. Which, again, unfortunately, very much the same thing we find in today's church. The problem isn't so much that young folks are having doubts about their faith, provoked by their education. Doubts happen. That's we all have doubts. That's a part of life. The problem is that in large part, their own teachers have been negligent and haven't given them a good theological foundation on which they can examine and ultimately refute and get over those doubts. Now, confirmation is great, but when we don't understand what we believe, why we believe it, the tendency is to fall away as soon as we begin to encounter people who, with different beliefs, who actually do know what they believe and do understand why they believe it. We need a better foundation when we go into education. The solution to doubt, or at least intellectual kinds of doubts, is to actually learn more about what God has taught us, instead of to try to make belief a moral obligation, which it sounds like that's kind of what happened to Schleiermacher. And I've known people who that happened to, and it's a really tragic thing. So, as a result of all this, Schleiermacher, he quickly abandoned Orthodox Christianity in his late teens. To quote a letter that he wrote to his father, who told him that faith is our obligation to God, so you better have faith. Schleiermacher said, Faith is the regalia of the Godhead, you say? Alas, dearest father, if you believe that without this faith no one can attain to salvation in the next world, or to tranquility in this, and such I know is your belief, then pray to God to grant it to me. For to me it is now lost. I cannot believe that he who called himself the Son of Man was the true eternal God. I cannot believe that his death was a vicarious atonement. So yeah, he couldn't believe it anymore. He could not believe Christianity anymore because he couldn't overcome the intellectual doubts that had been cultivated in him through his education. But then he went on to become a pastor and a theologian anyway. And that's the thing. I feel bad for Schleiermacher on one hand. I really do. But on the other hand, instead of doing the intellectually honest thing, which would be to leave the church, he decided that, no, he was going to stay on his career path and become a pastor and eventually a professor and theologian who taught other pastors, which, again, that does explain his approach to religion. Schleiermacher taught and believed that Christianity needed to be saved from itself. It had to change lest it pass away entirely. Because educated, enlightened people, they couldn't believe those old stories to be true anymore. Christianity can't have any real intellectual foundation. So you have to get rid of the doctrine. You have to get rid of the revelation and get rid of all the sorts of things that tortured Schleiermacher. But Schleiermacher decided instead that we need to find a new foundation for Christianity, and that's in our hearts. We have to find a new foundation in our feelings and in our experiences. So even if no particular religious doctrine is true, or even can be true, it is natural for humans to be religious. It's part of our experience. And so Schleiermacher tried to reorient Christian theology on the basis of experience. And according to Schleiermacher, the religious experience of all people came down to one common denominator, and that is a feeling of absolute dependence on a transcendent other. Yeah, very poetic, right? I'll say that again. It's a feeling of absolute dependence on a transcendent other. So what does that mean? I'll give you an example from my own experience. At the end of one summer in my youth, my dad was driving me back to college, which was a 3-hour drive along I-80 through northern Illinois farm country, which, if you've never done, that is about the flattest and most uninteresting terrain that you can imagine. But at some point at the trip, I don't know, I was sitting back in the passenger seat, I was just kind of zoning out, looking out the window, and I looked up and I looked around, and for whatever reason, I just took in the vastness of the sky all around me, and how it was the clouds and the sky were staying practically the same, even as the corn was just rushing by on either side. And for whatever reason, I was just suddenly struck by the enormity of the world and how absolutely small I was in comparison to that. My own insignificance besides the cosmos. And I just knew that God was very real. I just felt the reality of God very strongly in that moment. That is what Schleiermacher means by that feeling of absolute dependence on a transcendent other. Now, here's the thing. I don't want to say that experience of mine was totally meaningless. It's totally irrelevant. Because it's not. But there are a lot better reasons to believe in God than a sudden feeling like that. For one thing, not everybody has those moments. For another, it might have been a very, very long time since you've had a moment like that. And besides that, you can just as easily observe some kind of horrible calamity in the world and the suffering that accompanies it, and you can just as strongly feel that, God can't possibly be real, because a good God can't possibly exist and permit something like that to happen. And, I've had both of those feelings. And your feelings alone, they cannot tell you which of those is true. And they can't both be true. It is entirely subjective. It is entirely within yourself. Whereas real Christianity has us looking outside of ourselves at Jesus Christ. But for Schleiermacher, that it's all about that subjective internal look, all about that experience. And that experience is really the basis for all religions, not just Christianity. Because some people, a variety of people, have had exceptional experiences. Experiences that they're not just meaningful to them, but they're experiences that can be communicated to others. People like Moses, people like Jesus. Because, nobody's going to be making a religion based on, an I-80 big sky God experience anytime soon. But people like Moses or Jesus or Muhammad, they have really profound religious experiences that they can communicate to other people and trigger those same religious experiences in them. And those are the people who go on to found religions. Basically, they tell these stories that touch the heart and help people to have that feeling of absolute dependence. Moses instituted the law. This idea that, according to Schleiermacher, Moses came up with the idea of the law, this idea that mankind is accountable to something beyond ourselves. Again, that touches on our experience, it touches on our intuitions. But Moses had this idea and was able to run with it and express it to other people and keep that going on down through the years. Jesus, in contrast, he had this idea, this intuition about this love and mercy towards humanity, that we, this feeling that we are loved by something beyond ourselves. But whether it's Moses, whether it's Jesus, whether it's somebody else, they always call that something beyond ourselves God. And that's where the idea of God comes from this feeling of absolute dependence that so many people have had. Now, again, Schleiermacher being a Enlightenment intellectual, certainly believed that Christianity was the highest form of religion. It was better than all the other religions because, again, according to the Enlightenment, Germany is the peak of human existence. And if Christianity was the German religion, then it must be better than any of the alternatives. And Schleiermacher, he wanted to keep it that way. He wanted to keep Christianity on top of the pile by helping it to evolve and adapt, by getting rid of the old and outdated, dying for our sins crap, but still keep those inspiring stories that make us feel. And the result of all that was a radical change in the way that academic theology was practiced throughout Europe, throughout the West. And change things in huge and extremely negative ways. And we're going to pause there for now. And next time, we're going to pick it up and we're going to consider exactly what the changes wrought by this father of theological liberalism ended up looking like.